Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Marito's book on Buddhism and the section on reality and emptiness. Let us begin. So here are some philosophical questions. Here's a very basic philosophical question. What exists? That's something that people in the West ask. Philosophers ask that kinds of questions. In the philosophical world of Buddhism, they ask the question too, but they're good at emphasizing a particular way of going about answering that question. So here's a kind of a first step at answering the question, what exists? Well, there are some things that at least seem to be real. This is what more Bomarito is speaking. A maple tree, friendship, the number four, fire, a thought, a corporation, sunlight, a hole, a shout, a banana, plasma. So you might think all of these things are real, and you might think all of these things are real partly because, well, we can name them. I just did. And also because we can name them in an intelligible way. I speak the way I say a thought, you know at least roughly what I mean. And then we can talk about it, right? So we are capable of engaging in intelligible discourse about these things. The words have meaning, they make sense. So we think, hey, there's something in the world that corresponds with those words. So that's a very natural way of thinking about how to answer the question, what exists, and that's a very natural way of thinking about language. The deep down, the Buddhist way of thinking about these things is challenging that assumption. So challenging the assumption that the mere fact that we can think or we can speak intelligibly about something, we can use words, names, means that there is an underlying reality that we're capturing, that we're describing with the language. So language, the Buddhist claim, is not a straightforward guide to reality. And they like to point to all sorts of examples. Here's an example. Think of light versus darkness, right? We have two different words, and we can say something like, oh, it is dark in the room, or it is light in the room, and things like that. But if we start thinking about it, actually, darkness is not a thing in the world. Light is a thing in the world, right? Darkness just is the absence of light. So we use the word darkness, and it sounds like though, like it's the similar kind of word like light. But if you think about the way the actual world is, it turns out darkness is not a thing. It's just the absence of something else, namely light. So one of these words, light, seems to like get the world right in a way in which darkness doesn't. And yet when we speak about it, we don't make those distinctions. If you just go with the way the language works, it misguides you. It deceives you. The language is misguiding, right? It deceives you into thinking that darkness is just as real as light, but we know it's not. And it's worse, right? The more you start thinking about language, for example, we can talk about things that don't exist. We can say things like vampires hate garlic, and you might think that's true, like yeah, at least in the original story of the vampire, right? Uh, um, that's true, right? So it is a fact about vampires that they don't like garlic, and yet we know vampires don't exist. So we can speak meaningfully and perhaps even truthfully, in some sense of truthfully, about things that don't exist. And it gets even worse. We can even talk meaningfully about things that are impossible. It's not just that they don't exist, but that they cannot exist. I can say, for example, a triangle with four sides is unimaginable. And if you know enough geometry, you will say, yeah, correct. That's an imaginable figure. Why? Because that's incompatible with the definition. Four sides mean square or rectangle, and triangle means three. So like there cannot be an imaginable figure that is adequately described as a triangle and that it has four sides. Like it is true to say that that's unimaginable. So here we are speaking of things that are not just don't exist, but are impossible. And yet we can speak meaningfully about those things. Um, sometimes these linguistic distortions are forced by grammar, right? So the way we talk about it, sometimes the grammar is what messes it up. So think in English, we say things like "it is raining today," right? That's a way of capturing something in the world. But then we start thinking about it. What is that it that is doing the raining? Is it the rain? Is it the atmosphere? Is it nothing? Or like what's up with the it? It is raining. So in general, Buddhists are keen to highlight the different ways in which the way we speak about the world distorts or undermines what's actually in front of us. And furthermore, how we don't typically stop to think about it, where we use the language and then we think we're just describing what's in front of us when we're not. We're not aware of the fact that the language we use is deceptive. And here are a lot of different examples of this. So language is deceptive. I may be useful. It gets us to do things, right? So when I tell you it is raining outside, now you know to bring an umbrella. So it helps, right? You understand what I mean, and now it's useful. Now you can bring an umbrella. Even though if you think about the grammar, that like there's something weird going on. I'm not actually describing, at least the way I'm using the language. I'm actually not describing what is there. So that's the first main observation about philosophical inquiry. Do not rely too heavily on language. In fact, beware of the deceptive power of language. It might be useful, but it doesn't describe what is there. And here's a similar kinds of observation about thinking and philosophical questions. Sometimes the Buddha refused to answer questions like, is the universe eternal? How does the mind relate to the body? What happens after death? Those kinds of very interesting questions that a lot of philosophers in the West have spent a lot of time thinking about. The Buddha just refused to engage with those questions, and answer them. And you might think, why? Like, those are good questions, give us answers. So why did the Buddha refuse? Well, here's some reasons, some possible reasons in the very different cases. It might be harmful to the person asking these questions. Even it might be harmful if they hear the right answer. So say by these people being carried away by curiosity for its own sake. Remember, for Buddhism, the whole point is to solve the problem of suffering. And if you get carried away, spend your entire life thinking about whether the universe is eternal, you won't fix the problem of suffering. You just spend all this time thinking about something that won't help. So, and sometimes people operate at the basis of simplistic categories. So maybe the question is poorly framed. And one of the examples the author uses is thinking about the category healthy. Sometimes people use the category healthy as an all or none category. Either this particular kind of activity or food is healthy, in which case you can have as much as you want, or it's not healthy, in which case you shouldn't have any. But of course, if you understand the way the body works, that's not it, right? Health is a complicated combination of a multiplicity of things, and even things that are healthy, like apples. If you have too many apples, it becomes unhealthy, right? So it's healthy is kind of relative to the operations of the body in large quantities of something that in small quantities are healthy or no longer healthy, right? Healthy is a complicated category. But if you have a simplistically minded person who has the all or nothing conception of health, it might not be good for them to start thinking too much about what health is, because they just misunderstand it and mess it up. In other words, the questions can be misguided. That's why the Buddhist philosopher doesn't engage with them. Here's an example of another question being poorly formulated. So anyway, here's the general observation about philosophy and language from the Buddhist perspective. The whole point of examining philosophical questions is to help solve the problem of how to live. People relate to these questions in different ways, and many are, from a Buddhist point of view, not very good. For some, it's a fun way to pass the time. That's a way of relating to these questions. The way people in comic book shops can enjoy arguing about whether Superman is stronger than Incredible Hulk, right? That's just kind of a pastime. It doesn't get any farther than the curiosity part. For others, making clever arguments become a kind of game they play to show how clever they are. But none of these are very good reasons to tackle these philosophical questions, since they don't help solve the problem. So from a Buddhist perspective, the problem originates the whole enterprise, and the philosophical questions that are taken seriously and that are answered have to do with the ultimate goal of solving the problem. That's the way of framing and understanding what philosophical discourse looks like within the Buddhist tradition. So anyway, with all of that set up, let's actually engage in philosophical questions in the Buddhist tradition. And a main one has to do with the nature of collections. And here is one of the classic examples in Buddhist philosophy. So Nahasena, one of the great philosophers, says that one of the following must be true. So think of an object like the picture here of a car. We can say things like, I have a car, I bought a new car, my car is in the garage, right? Like, you know what I mean? The word car refers to something we think in the world is intelligible. But now we're asking whether cars really exist. Are there such things as cars? And Nagasena points out, well, if there are cars, then the car is either the same or identical as the parts. It can be identical to all of the parts, one of the parts, or none of the parts. Like Nagasena seems to think those are all of the options. So there are tires here, and there are wheels, and so on. There's a motor. And you might think, oh yeah, and there's also a car, which is kind of somehow all of those things. And then Nagasani said, well, let's think about the word car and how, whether it captures something real in the world. He thinks all of the options, the ones enumerated, lead to absurdities. If we think the car is identical to one of the parts, then absurdities follow. Things like, oh, then the whole is identical to just one of the parts and not the others. That seems pretty weird. Like if you choose like the motor, like why would the car be the motor and not the wheel, or not like the tire? Like it seems strange. Or the seat. It seems that any of the pieces, parts you choose to be the one that is identical for the car, it just is absurd. It cannot be that. So it can't be that the car is identical to one of the parts. You might think, oh, well, then it's all of the parts. But then Nakasena says, well, think about that carefully too. That collection cannot, he says, the collection of the parts be identical. The collection, the car cannot be identical with all of the parts, because a single thing, the collection is a single thing, the car is one, and the parts are many. And many is not one, right? Like very basic mathematical. One, many is more than one. One is not more than one. Therefore, the collection cannot be just all of the parts. And another way of bringing out the absurdity is by pointing out, like this car, for example, you may think is, well, if a tire blows out, you can replace the tire, in which case it will still be the same car, but with a new part. But if the car just is all of the parts, in removing the tire, you change the car, right? It's no longer all of the parts, but if the car is all of the parts, then it's no longer the same car. So absurdities follow from thinking that the car is identical to all of the parts. The car cannot be identical to one of the parts. That's absurd. It cannot be identical with all of the parts. That's absurd. So perhaps you might think, well, that's because or the parts and come together, and then there's like the car, which is not like just the parts. It's something else, something over and above. It's something that is none of the parts, right? It's something other than the parts. But Nagasena says, well, think about that carefully. Like if the car were none of the parts or separable from the parts, then in principle, you can start taking away the parts and it will be the same car. And we think that that sounds fine when we take away a part, right? So there's the car and it's not identical to the parts. So you take one of the wheels and then you put a new wheel and you think, oh, a part has been replaced, but it's still the same car. You might think that's true because the car is not identical to any of the parts. But then Hassan said, well, if you think that's what's going on, you take another part and then another part and then another part. And if the car is not identical to any of them, then at one point you'll have none of the parts and steal the car. So you might like, but that's pretty weird, right? You cannot really like tell someone I have a car in the garage, but none of the parts are there. They're outside of the garage. Like, no, that's absurd. That makes no sense. And Nagasena says, yeah, it makes no sense. None of these options make sense. Why do none of these options make sense? Because there really is no car. Car just is a word we use, a convenient word, an easy way of speaking about the complicated arrangement of the parts and the functions that they perform when they come together. But don't fool yourself. It's just a language deceiving you. There is nothing there other than the parts. There is no car. It's just the parts and the way in which they come together. Now, Vomarito points out, well, maybe there's another option that Nahasena doesn't point out. Perhaps the car is some of the parts, not just one or all or none, but just some of them. But then he points to philosophical problems about vagueness. He thinks, well, like how many? 8, 6, 3? Which of those? Like the wheel, the motor, and 3 tires? Like, well, wait a minute. That looks just as puzzling, just as bad as the problems with thinking that the car is just one of the parts. If you think of some of the parts, and it seems that also absurdities follows, right? You take a tire and then you take another tire and you think like, well, at one point, which of the parts are the ones that make the car? And it seems pretty weird to say, well, you can take three wheels and it's still the car, but don't take the fourth one because it will no longer be a car. Like no, like then isn't the fourth wheel, the one that makes the car? Anyway, all sorts of weird absurdities follow from thinking that the car is identical to some of the parts. So this fourth possibility doesn't seem to help, Bomarito points to. So in any case, the Buddhist conclusion seems to hold. What is the car? It's just a way of speaking about the parts. There's nothing in the real world other than the parts and the way they come together. It's just a nice linguistic kind of tool that we use to say, oh, there's something in my garage that has all these parts that is, kind of arranged in a particular way that I can drive around. And like, it's just a way of condensing a lot of cool information. But that's it. There's no car. So what follows from this? Wholes or collections, like cars, are not real. At best, only their parts are. There's just a convenient way of talking about the parts. So, okay, let's talk about emptiness then. So, see, you might think, okay, fair enough. Like, why did we spend so much time talking about the car? Like, the collections are not real, only the parts. Yeah, fair enough. Like this is too much talking. Like, why are we spending so much talking about this? It might be the cars are not real, but like the parts are, right? Like the wheel is there, the tires there, the chair, the seat is there, the motor is there. And then the Buddhists will say, is it? Like, let's think about it. Let's take the wheel, for example, right? So you think the car is real, but then you were convinced that actually, never mind, the car is just a way of speaking about the parts. But you might think, hey, but the parts are real. Like there's the wheel there. And then the Buddhists will say, oh, okay, well, what is the wheel? Is the wheel, notice that the wheel has parts, right? There's the tire, there's the rim, there's the thing in the middle. And then the Buddhist is going to ask you, is the wheel identical with one of the parts of the wheel, all of the parts of the wheel, none of the parts of the wheel, some of the parts of the wheel? Right, you see where this is going. If the argument worked for the car, it's going to work for the wheel. And now the car is not real. It's just a convenient way of talking about parts like wheels, but wheels are not real. It's just a convenient way of talking about, its parts, like, the tire. And then you may think, oh, but I still have the tire, but like you haven't thought about it carefully, right? The tire is composed of things like, molecular compounds and things like that. So it has parts. Everything that has parts, now it's going to be a collection, so it's not going to be real. It's just going to be a convenient way of talking about the collections. And then the reality suddenly seems to be shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And then you might ask, oh, like, does that mean, are there any fundamental parts that are real? And here Buddhists disagree. So a sandcastle is just a convenient way of talking about the tiny rocks, the sand arranged in a particular way. Are these real? So Buddhists sometimes talk about the smallest possible parts that are no longer breakable. And they call those dharmas. They're like space-time points or something like that. They're things that are no longer dividable, things that have no parts. And then you might think, okay, those fundamental things that themselves have no parts, out of which everything else is built, dharmas, are those real? Like that's the fundamental question. And then the Buddha says something like, well, like dharmas, those fundamental things, they're not really real, but they're empty. And you might think, okay, empty. What does empty mean? And here is the kind of common way of putting it. To be empty is to be purely relational. In other words, what it is for Dharma to be is for it to be empty. What it is to be empty is for it to be embedded in a network of relations. Dharma just is a position in a network of relations. That's all there is. And then things that are composed out of that, like larger parts like wheels and cars, are just easy ways or simple shortcuts for talking about the very complicated network of relations between dharmas, which themselves are just relational, right? So everything's relational. And the contrast here is with something like freestanding, independent, substantive beings. Like you might have thought you have a car, and then you can replace a wheel and it will still be the same car. Like that kind of thing that endures through change, that remains the same as time goes by, that is kind of self-standing or independent, given things moving around it. That kind of idea that is very commonsensical. The Buddha says it might be commonsensical, but the world is not that way. The arguments we looked at are supposed to show that. A way of bringing that out, an old way of bringing that out, is by thinking about a Hindu goddess, Indra. Indra has this net. So a net that stretches infinitely in all directions. So it's an infinitely long net. And each knot in the net, there's a jewel. And the thought is, there's an infinitely long net, and it has knots, and each knot has a jewel, and the jewels are the dharmas. The net is reality. And then you want to know, oh, what is the objective, what is the status of those jewels? What would the jewels look like? And the thought is the jewels reflect light, right? Like the image here. So if you look closely at the jewel, any jewel, you see at the surface a reflection of the rest of the net. So in each of the surfaces of each of the jewels, there is this reflection of the whole infinite network of jewels that is the net. So the net is reality, different ways of talking about different kind of combinations of knots, is language. The particular knots, the particular dharmas, the no longer breakable things are just these ways of relating back to the whole. What the jewels are is just the particular different way in which they relate to the entire whole, the way in which they mirror or they represent everything around them. That is what it is to be relational. What the jewel is just kind of the surface reflecting the rest. And then everything's built out of that. That's fundamental reality, claim the Buddhist. Okay, let's end here. I'll see you next time.